The second school of thought is called the positive school. Some people also refer to this as the scientific school of thought. This was a school that was developed about probably 100 years after Beccaria, and it was attributed to the work of a man, again, by the same first name, Cesare Lombroso. Lombroso was a science man. He was a man of scientific training. He had been a surgeon in the Italian army. And toward the latter part of his career, he was director of an insane asylum. And in this insane asylum, he began to observe scientific observation that people who committed crime, and at least ended up in his insane asylum, but others as well, he thought had different appearances than people who were not criminal. Now, a basic tenet of the scientific method, of course, is that of comparison. We compare groups of people, such as criminals and non-criminals, and we look for differences between the two. And then we theorize that these differences may or may not be causative factors. Due to the fact that Lombroso did not have access to all the scientific methods and techniques that we have today, his efforts at observation were somewhat limited. And what he did was establish what we now know as the school of phrenology. And his emphasis was on looking at the physical differences, the physical characteristics of the people which he observed in the prisons and in his insane asylum, and comparing those physical differences to people who were not involved in criminality. And what he did was take measurements of skull circumferences, lengths of arms, ratios of different parts of the body, and he attempted to show that he could demonstrate that people who were criminal had different body makeups. Now, a lot of people in retrospect, quite frankly, think that some of these body differences that he found was maybe a product of having been involved in the Italian criminal justice system and insane asylums. And his thoughts for many years, and I suppose it's still true to say, have rather been not debunked, but at least taken with a grain of salt. We don't believe that physical measurements are, as Lombroso would say, atavistic tendencies, the tendency of some human beings to throw back to earlier days of evolution, is really an adequate explanation of why people commit crime. As we move away from Lombroso, we move on up into the more modern times, we see that criminologists begin to logically think about crime as being caused by factors either external to the individual or by factors internal. Let's take a look, first of all, at the kinds of thoughts of the criminologists as they look for factors external to the individual, causes that occur outside of the individual body, the individual person. And we find that here we have various categories of crime. One of the first categories is the category of social disorganization. Social disorganization theories began back in Chicago, affiliated with the University of Chicago by the team of Shaw and McKay. Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay worked together to begin to identify where crimes occurred in the city of Chicago. And as they plotted out the occurrence of crimes, they began to notice that there were certain areas of the city that had much more crime than other areas. And as they plotted out their charts, they actually developed what we call the concentric zone system, concentric zone theory. And that's the idea that as you get further and further away from the city center, the more densely, or the less densely, crime occurs. Most of the crime that they studied were within a short distance of the center of the city. And they began to ask the question, why? Why would this occur? Do people in the center city have less free will or more free will? Are they more or less seeking pleasure than other people? And they did not think that this was an adequate explanation. So what they began to think about was the characteristics of the neighborhoods, the characteristics of the communities themselves. And what they discovered as they looked at these communities very, very closely was that the institutions in certain neighborhoods that were characterized by high crime rates suffered from an organization of many of the social institutions, economic institutions, that they believed yielded a control over most of us. They found, for example, that the quality of the schools may not have been as good. The types of businesses that were in these high crime areas were businesses that did not pay as much money to support people to the same degree of and level of quality of life as those people who lived further and further away. I think what they were really looking at was the early process of urban flight, that many people began to abandon the downtown areas and begin to move out, the businesses, the industries, into suburbia and the surrounding areas, leaving a disorganized inner city area. But what we learn from the Shaw and McKay studies is this: the causes of crime are to be found in how our social institutions organize themselves and the degree of organization. Now, we see behind me a chart which was developed in more recent times, but very adequately characterizes the kinds of thoughts that Shaw and McKay had. We see that Shaw and McKay would say, well, the first step of the social disorganization process is poverty. For whatever reasons, the flight of businesses and the flight of certain people of more wealth, as they left the inner city, they left pockets of poverty. And the consequences of that is what we see, that what Shaw and McKay saw, concentrations or pockets of poverty. This led to the second stage of our chart says social disorganization. The institutions which control many of our lives began to break down. The schools perhaps would have been characterized by higher delinquency rates and behavior problems. The families may have begun to break down, single-parent families, and the problems of control that a family traditionally has in transmitting values, that is, values of normal behavior, non-criminal behavior. And so we can follow the chart across: the breakdown of the social control, the creation of the criminal areas, and then the cultural transmission of criminal values, of values that are not according to what the law says our values should perhaps be. And of course, the end result of that is that we see a development of criminal careers. People grow up in these areas thinking that this is as legitimate a career as any other career that many of us may choose. So the idea of social disorganization, it says if you want to know something about the causes of crime, look at poverty, look at the consequences of poverty, and look at how the social institutions such as schools, families, and businesses have become changed, have become somewhat disorganized, and losing the power over us to keep us from entering into criminal activity.